Hello and welcome back to Read Becca. I'm continuing to wrap up Booktube Prize books. This was for the semifinals round for translated fiction. I read Inseparable by Simone de Beauvoir and translated by Sandra Smith, and I'm not going to hold this up very long because it's going to white out my screen. So as you can see on the cover, there are two women, and that's the focus of this story. It's a very short novella. It's only 150 something pages, and it's about this very intense, inseparable relationship between these two young women. And they start in school. They're meeting as one of them is getting treated for burns. So Sylvie is kind of a self-insert for the author, Simone de Beauvoir, and the other character, Andre, is a insert for a friend. This is based on a real-life exchange between her and another young woman, their intense friendship. Letters that they wrote to each other are included as part of this text, and so it's clearly fictionalized to some degree. We can see from what's in the letters. However, it rings very, very true to this intense relationship that we see from these letters. So what I think is so powerful about this is we're seeing this relationship between these two women as they are coming of age. They're grappling with their place in the world. They're dealing with societal expectations, specifically from their mothers and their families. They're figuring out how they relate to other people, to the world, how they understand themselves emotionally, physically, and spiritually. So I kept coming back to a previous book I had read for this prize, An Apprenticeship or the Book of Pleasures by Clarice Lispector. And I think my impression, I've never read anything from either of those authors previously, de Beauvoir or Lispector, but I think they're both kind of major feminist thinkers. De Beauvoir had previously written The Second Sex and is kind of a French existentialist. So I think they were grappling with the same themes and messages in these two books. For me, this one was much more successful. It's a lot more literal and direct versus Lispector's book. They're both very short, and I think those themes that I touched on, I talked about basically the same things. They're talking about the expectations of the world around what their role is in relationships, in romantic relationships, at different times, different time periods. This is set in post-World War I timeline, and the other book is much, much later, and they're different parts of the world, but I can see the same expectations and weight on these young women as they're trying to figure out their role in the world. So I think it's extremely accessible to read because it is so character focused, and it's really just an account of these two young women as they're growing up, as they're figuring themselves out. And it's exceptional in how character focused it is because they're such dynamic characters. So Sylvie is this very sort of bland character. She doesn't have anything really special about her. She doesn't stand out. She's kind of at the top of her class, but she doesn't seem to be that exceptional type A person who is really a leader. She just sort of is achieving to do the right thing. Whereas Andre is completely the opposite. She is reckless and rambunctious, and she doesn't really listen to anyone. She's very independent. And so those two clashing perspectives, clashing realities and understandings of the world, being so intimately close and loving each other so much is really interesting because they have such a different view and different desires about how they move through the world. So I thought that was done really, really well. I think getting into spoiler territory, the major downfall for this, for me, is that it ends so abruptly. So, spoiler here, there's additive elements included in this book. So there's an introduction from Margaret Atwood, which, as with lots of older works, when they have that introduction, somebody spoils it in the introduction, and that is the case here. So I did wait till after, but was very surprised that it actually touched on what happens. And that abrupt ending is that Andre dies at the end. And that's just it. It just ends there. We don't get any exploration to how Sylvie actually processes that emotionally at all. So I thought that was a huge miss. I felt like this needed to be built out more and explored more, and it just wasn't. So that was the big miss for me. And with this being such a short work, I felt that rushed ending really did it a disservice. However, I do have one kind of read on it that made that even more powerful for me as well. When I was thinking about this after finishing it, I was pondering the idea, because of all these societal expectations. I think the big draw for Sylvie to Andre is it's a side of herself that she doesn't engage. Andre is loud and rambunctious and reckless. She's so independent and never denies herself anything, really. So that's completely the opposite of who Sylvie is. Andre at one point talks about having wine and coffee for breakfast and just does whatever she wants. And so I think I could get more out of this, thinking of this as an interpretation where Sylvie and Andre are inseparable because they're two sides of the same woman rather than two separate women. Because Andre is these parts of Sylvie that she doesn't really engage. And when you think of them as separate characters, that's why she's so alluring. But thinking of them as together, I can read into that ending, that dramatic death at the end, being that Sylvie maybe had to let this side of herself die in order to fit into societal expectations and let that go. That she couldn't ever put her independence and her loudness internally forward. And so I think that was a more interesting way for me to read this than what's literally on the page. So I did, I think, get a lot out of that read here. So overall, I think that taking that away really added to it, but this was just too short and underdeveloped to be as good as some of the other things that I've read. So I have a hard time with ranking this. It was fine, is really how I felt. The writing was very good, was very engaging from a character perspective. There's not a whole lot of plot. It's very much just about these girls growing up and living their lives. But it was beautifully written, and I definitely felt like it was worth having read. I do think there's a lot of additive elements to this. So we have that foreword by Margaret Atwood, which was excellent. We have an afterword by Sylvie de Beauvoir, who obviously is not the character from the book, but is in fact de Beauvoir's daughter, who she named the same name as the character. And then we also have letters between Simone de Beauvoir and the real individual this Andre character was based on, her friend Zada. And I think all of that additive stuff was actually more engaging and better than the story itself for me. So taking that away, that wasn't the novel by the author. And without having all that additive stuff, this was kind of bland. Yeah, so I think it was very middle of the road. It didn't really stand out from the pack, so it was fine. It was not a bad reading experience, but I do think all the additive stuff that wasn't contributed as part of the novel actually really, really contributed to enhancing the reading experience. And that means I can't read this as like a top-notch novel on its own. So that's what I thought of Inseparable by Simone de Beauvoir and translated by Sandra Smith. Thanks so much for watching.